Good morning. Welcome to our first of 3 Sunday Maritime Reads. My name is Nina Ferry Montanile, and I am the Head of Adult and Reference Services at Oak Bluffs Public Library. This September, we celebrate our 6th annual Maritime Month in honor of Gordon Goodwin, whose family left the Library Friends of Oak Bluffs a generous fund for us to continue celebrating and remembering maritime history and culture here on Martha's Vineyard. This morning, I'll be reading from the book Disaster on Devil's Bridge by George A. Hough Jr., who lived here on the vineyard and spent his summers growing up here. The reason I chose this book from our maritime collection is that I was good friends with George A. Hough III, the author's son. To me, growing up in West Tisbury, he was an older community figure who was deeply invested in sharing the history of the vineyard and also instilling in me a love of literature. So unlike years in the past where I have read from different books each week, this year I'm going to read different excerpts from the same book. Disaster on Devil's Bridge focuses on the tragic loss of the steamer named City of Columbus on January 18th in 1884. The majestic steamship ran aground on the treacherous Devil's Bridge, a formation of rocks and reef off the Gayhead Cliffs in Aquinnah, Massachusetts. Of the 45 officers and 87 passengers, only 17 crew and 12 passengers made it back to land, making this shipwreck one of the worst ocean disasters of all time. Reporter George Hough spent years following this story, tracking down survivors and witnesses to piece together the horrific details and tragic mistakes to uncover the mystery of the disaster on Devil's Bridge. So hopefully you'll find the story interesting. Today I'm going to start with the introduction and the foreword. And then next week I'll move into the details of the accident as well as the people who were on the ship. Introduction. It is most fitting that the first full account of the loss of the steamer City of Columbus should be written by a newspaperman who grew up close by the scene, because the story of the tragedy was one of the big news stories of the day. In 1884, American journalism was approaching its high watermark. Newspapers reflected their own interpretation of news event rather than the mass media wire service, and the individual reporter had an opportunity to scoop the story, as well as give it an individual touch. The disaster of the City of Columbus was the news event of its time. The newspaper's first knowledge of it came when the revenue cutter Dexter arrived in New Bedford on the evening of January 18, 1884, with a handful of the survivors and 4 of the dead. The telegraph flashed word to the news centers of the country. In Boston, 2 young newspapermen boarded a special train for New Bedford and joined Zephaniah W. Pease, a young reporter on the New Bedford Mercury. The group sent out the first stories of the tragedy. In later years, Pease became the Mercury's editor and one of New England's outstanding newspapermen. George Hough Jr. heard the story directly from Mr. Pease and also from those actually on the vineyard scene. In later years, he made a careful search for recollections of others, including the survivors and their descendants. It was his newspaper training which helped sift the accumulated material and develop it into a well-documented and full story. There is in this City of Columbus tragedy a certain pattern of classic fate. Only a few yards separated the steamer from safety or disaster. In the cold light of that bitter morning, when from shore the survivors were sighted in the rigging, the first inkling of what had transpired was now starkly evident. What of Captain Wright, the steamer's master? Why had not the helmsman remembered to change course off Tarpaulin Cove, which was always done at this point in Vineyard Sound? Why were no women or children saved? These and many other questions are carefully explored in this text. In the south wing of the Stillman Building at Mystic Seaport is one of the quarter boards from the city of Columbus. High up, stretching across the top of a bay window, its handsomely carved length has been a mute memento of the steamer's doom on Devil's Bridge. Now, through the pages which follow, we have not only a complete record of the event, but one written by a man who has spent years of feeling out its mysteries and balancing its facts. It is good to have such a story at last in its fullness, if for no other reason than to remind us that the sea's dominance is eternal, that it continues to be ruthless, and that disasters are always to be a part of our maritime scene. Inheriting the newspaper tradition from his father, one of the best-known newspapermen of his day, George A. Hough, Jr., was born in New Bedford on July 22, 1894, and knew the old waterfront in its last days of whaling. His maternal grandfather was a vineyard whaling master, and that island was his summer home for many years. Upon graduation from Columbia University's School of Journalism, he became a reporter and rewrite man on the New York World, rising to the day city editor's position. The following 10 years found him news editor of the New Bedford Standard, and in 1929 he became editor and publisher of the Falmouth Enterprise on Cape Cod, beginning an association which he since carried on with his wife and son. Mr. and Mrs. Hough in 1963 were named to the 50th anniversary honors list of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and presented a bronze medallion. Over the years, their contributions of many historical features, particularly in the columns of the Enterprise, made this honor richly deserved. His interest in the city of Columbus story was strengthened as he pursued his research. As Mr. Hough tells in his foreword, his interest in the sea tragedy began in his boyhood summers on Martha's Vineyard, and they continued through his young manhood and found a fulfillment in his piecing together of the scattered fragments of the story during the past few years. Thus we have, as if dredged from the depths of the past, the complete record of disaster on Devil's Bridge. The foreword was written by Edward Stackpole. Our boyhood summers were spent on the north shore of Martha's Vineyard. Our nearest neighbor was old Mr. Rogers, a retired whaleman, with a tuft of whisker on his chin and thin gold hoops in his ears. We went to his small, weather-beaten hillside home for eggs from his barnyard and for lobsters that he caught in the waters below. Young eyes early discovered a striking incongruity in the homely little living room which Mrs. Rogers kept so cozily. Over the doorway to the seldom-used parlor was an oval tablet of porcelain. It was fancily lettered in faded rose and black, Social Hall. We asked questions and learned Mr. Rogers had pried that tablet from the wreckage long ago tossed up on our beach. For the first time, my brother and I heard of the wreck of the steamer, the City of Columbus. In the evenings, our family often paid calls to Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. Mother sat with Mrs. Rogers in the living room. Father and Mr. Rogers sat in the tiny kitchen, the tiny coal stove between them. Mr. Rogers smoked his corn cob and spat frequently on the red coals. Father smoked his cigar, and he sometimes spat too. My brother and I sat on the threshold of the doorway between the visiting couples, and we listened. Mr. Rogers talked of his whaling days. I remember how he smacked his lips when he recalled the beautiful women of Talcahuano on the coast of Chile. We boys liked it best when Mr. Rogers talked about the city of Columbus. He told of the harvest washed up along shore as the sea tore the sunken wreck apart and flushed out her holds. There were kegs of butter. Mrs. Rogers scraped away the water-damaged crush and found welcome food beneath. There were nests of these tubs. The luck of Mr. Rogers with tubs had been exceptional. As near as my brother and I could calculate, the tide had brought in enough tubs to supply the Rogers family and collaterals for several lifetimes. Recollection of the tubs always stirred the anger of Mr. Rogers. "The revenuers came and took them all away from us," he would say, and he spat in disgust at the coals. Then Mr. Rogers would tell us about the bodies which drifted ashore with the shattered bits of the ship's woodwork, the ship's fittings, kegs, and tubs. We were youthfully fascinated to learn one body had come up on Gray's Beach just to the west of us, and another at Daggett's Landing, just to the eastward of our very own shore where we swam and Mr. Rogers hauled his lobster boat. I heard more about the city of Columbus from Zephaniah W. Pease. As a young reporter, he gave the country the first news of the disaster and worked for days with correspondents who came from the cities to report the aftermath. Lengthening years found Mrs. Hough and myself editors of the Falmouth Enterprise, a Cape Cod weekly. Official records had disappeared. It was surprising to discover there was scarcely a word in books about the Devil's Bridge disaster. A chapter in the maritime history of the coast was preserved only in decaying newspapers of the time and in human recollections dying one by one. I had already tapped these recollections. The Enterprise stories brought us more. A letter from Maine took me to a woman of 80 in our state who was a sister of the lost stewardess of Columbus. I found the great niece of the ship's master alert and helpful on the eve of her 85th birthday. I came to know the daughters who just remembered their lost father, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who each contributed their bits of fact. Accumulating information urged me on, for the story became more and more stirring. So in recent years, I have gone further and further afield to bring together the almost lost narrative. The search has reached from Georgia through New England and into the Maritime provinces. The other day in the Federal Records Center in Boston, a persistent custodian turned up the final fragment of surviving record, the steamship company's list of passengers who sailed from Boston on January 17, 1884. The last voyage of the steamer City of Columbus. Here is their story. So next week, we'll continue to hear about their story. The other great thing about this book is that it's short in length, and it also has lots of images and pictures in it, which I always enjoy, including pictures of the passengers on the ship, both those who survived and those who did not. So looking forward to seeing you next week with your favorite cup of coffee or tea. And please check our events calendar on the library's website and join some of our other maritime outings this September, as well as many of the talks that we're having towards the end of the month. Take care.